Morning, everybody. Sorry about that. I think that was my fault from my end. So I do apologise. Good morning. Welcome to Pearson's International GCSE Geography Exam Insights. Hopefully, this will be really useful material for you to take forward in your learning and your teaching, and certainly benefit the students as well. I'm an examiner on a couple of these papers, both in the January in the January session and in the summer session as well. Okay, so let's have a look at the agenda for today. We're going to give a quick introduction, and then we're going to do a detailed analysis of paper 1 and paper 2. Okay, the content should be in the examiner's reports, which are on the website, and we'll certainly be able to look at certain other factors as well. There'll be feedback with both sets of papers. We won't have time to go over everything due to the length of this one, but we'll go through as much as we can and hopefully give you a really good understanding of how students should be attempting this paper. So let's start with paper 1. And we're going to look at this and work through the highlights of the key points, looking at candidate performance. We'll start by looking at some questions in section A and give the amount of questions and the time limits. As I said, we won't cover every question, but we'll look at most of the comments in terms of candidates' performances. Okay, so we'll start with question 1C, and you might remember this. It said study figure 1A in the resource booklet that suggests two pieces of evidence from the map that this is an upland area. A student here talks about the type of rainfall, showing that it's typical of upland areas and the land usage being grasslands. And to achieve a proportion of candidates were able to achieve 4 marks. There was quite a lot of students here who got 4. The most common responses focused on contours linked to height and gradients, cliffs, boulders, loose rocks, those sort of things. And that was really good. They were using the evidence here. And we found that most students were able to get 4, but there was a problem in terms of students who decided to talk about what wasn't there, and therefore that wasn't credited as well. So it required students to look at it and sort of make reference to what was on the picture. And this one here, you can see. We can see here that this got 4 out of 4. It was a good, solid answer. It went through the idea of grasslands dominated by land usage, of rainfall and topography of the area being very steep with the contour lines. So we joined those 2 points together. But remember, try to tell students that it really doesn't benefit them to talk about what isn't there. It's about what is there, and that's what gets the marks. Okay. If you've any questions, just feel free to put them into the text box and we'll go through them. So this next question, 1E, says explain two different causes of water pollution. These were generally strong. They demonstrated a good awareness of the types of river pollution, and most could develop this and explain why it happens. Where candidates didn't achieve full marks, it was usually because they had written about the same source of pollution twice or had misinterpreted the question, identifying a cause, but developed this to give an impact on the river of water pollution on the environment. This is not the focus of the question. It was the causes of rivers we wanted. You see from this response, which is on the principal examiner's report, there is a mark for factories as a source of pollution, but there isn't really credit for waste thrown into the river. This is sort of seen as too vague. So make sure that your candidates are writing about specifics of these things. That's really important. The second point on farming was much better. It used good terminology. It talked about the transfer of pesticides by overland flow, and therefore that got the top. That would have been 2 out of 2. So 2 out of 2 for the first one, 1 out of 2 for the second. The other way around, and therefore this one got 3 out of 4. So it's a decent answer, but again, stop being woolly in that little bit there. That waste can be thrown into the river. Needs to tell us exactly what that waste is. In question 1G, it says here, study figure 1C in the resource booklet. There's a big resource. This is an extract from paper 2 on page 21 to 22 of the examiner's report. This was an 8-mark extended writing question, and it required to blend their use of resource, AO4, with their knowledge and understanding of the issues presented, which is an AO3 skill. Many candidates clearly understood the resource to describe the areas of the world that experience water shortages, and these were linked to basic reasons, most often relating to the information provided in the text boxes. Some candidates used the information from the resource and added links to different causes of water shortages based on development, as well as the links to latitude. And some were able to link the developed data on precipitation and sunshine rates to that evaporation as well, which was really good. It was overall generally well done. And it was these that we'll see. We'll have a look at these in the next page, and we'll have a look at one or two. You can see here, really, to access the higher marks, candidates needed to go beyond simply describing what's shown in the resource and provide several clear reasons for water shortages in different parts of the world, and one country with different levels of development. The command word analyze needs to be addressed really by candidates to achieve the full marks. They found this quite demanding, and there was often minimal judgment demonstrated in their responses. The candidate here that you're reading through, they should work through each location shown in the resource and explain why the region is likely to experience water shortages. They explain which of the factors is likely to be impacting each country, focusing on the population and average precipitation and sunshine hours. They've demonstrated the importance of precipitation and sunshine by linking the rates of evaporation. They also make links to the levels of development and how this may influence the demand for water. There is a concluding statement at the top too, which can be seen in the full response on the resource. So you can see there is some good ideas here. We can't show it all, but we can see there's some really good development as well. Okay. In this next question 1G again, analyze the possible reasons for these water shortages. Here we see a country. This is an answer we see here, which is a bit of a lower level responses, as these tend to work through the free locations and providing a basic answer. That kind of point and explanation kind of thing that didn't really work for this question, as it was an analyze. They gave simplistic reasons, providing descriptions of the data, but no clear reasons were really fully explored. And sometimes they would link these. So this says reasons for water shortages could mainly link to overpopulation. And you see that could mainly link, as well as the amount of sunshine or heat they experience within the region. So again, it's not really well explained. We're not really sure of what they're doing. A country like Egypt is quite big, with average sunshine hours being 4,400 per year. Reasons to that could be the deserts the country is full with. So again, you can see it's not fully explained, not fully developed, and therefore can't really access those main sort of marks. Okay. Okay, somebody's just asked, what did each of these score? Because they're not fully there, it's difficult to actually fully say on this one. I think that last one would have got about 3 or 4. There's obviously another point there that I can't read and we don't have access to, but they are all on the examiner's report if you want to go to there. In question 2B3, this was really an AO2 one. Explain one type of coastal movement. Candidates were sort of required to explain that one type, and there has been an improvement here in our understanding of coastal mass movement. So we've done well in terms of teaching this. Many candidates were able to identify a correct type of mass movement, although many chose different types of coastal processes, often types of weathering or erosion. So you've got to be careful and make sure they understand which ones are which. Some that did identify the correct type of mass movement just then described how materials move down the slope rather than actually explaining that mass movement. This response was awarded 2 out of 2 as it identified slumping and provided a reason. As you can see, slumping occurs when weathered material moves down a slope at great speed, often due to it having increased weight as rainfall has saturated it. So it's sort of talking about that slumping, which occurs, and we can see that quite well. So that's a decent answer to that question. In question 2D, explain one conflict might occur between different users of coastlines. This was worth 3 marks. And to find the 3 marks, it demanded the challenging to develop that one point in sufficient depth. And these can be quite difficult for some students to really access that 3rd mark, as candidates tend to find this challenging as it's discussing specific stakeholders and players, which is helpful when addressing questions on conflicts. The best responses provide a specific group, really, and explain their views, and an opposing group and their views. So it kind of helps to develop that point. This one at the top here was awarded 3 marks as it highlights a conflict between developers and environmentalists, which differ over whether a tourist resort should be developed. It then highlights the view of developers want money and profit, and that's the mark, whilst environmentalists want a preserved area with little human sight. So it gives the conflict, explains why the two differ from 2 different perspectives. So that's a good way of approaching a question like that. The example at the bottom, however, just had an inferred conflict. It says some people may want, and this is a real key element of answering questions, that idea of some. If a candidate writes some, they're kind of saying we don't really know who they are, and therefore we're never really going to develop our answer. State the reason, or state the user. So rather than saying some people, it will be environmentalists, shop owners, or whoever it might be, but actually state who they are. That's always going to be more beneficial for a student to access better marks. Okay, straightforward 1 mark answer. State one characteristic of a tropical cyclone. Candidates were really very quickly. You sometimes see students trying to write everything they know, but this is a state thing, so it requires only a short response. And many were able to answer this correctly. Many provided factors that affected their formation, though, rather than characteristics. So as we can see, a lot of candidates wrote about sea surface temperature, latitude, ocean depth. None of these were awarded marks, as these were factors that affected their formation and not characteristics. It's those sort of things. You can see why they've done it. It's a shame, but obviously the top one gets 1 mark and the bottom one doesn't get any. Okay, it's kind of one of those questions where students immediately go to the things they've learned more in detail, rather than the actual sort of, I suppose, simplistic version of that. In this one that was worth 3 marks, explain one physical factor that makes people more vulnerable to natural hazards. Candidates were sort of required to explain one physical factor, which, while many could identify the factor, they were not always able to develop the point. A significant proportion of candidates stated an economic or social factor and did so and did not address the question. The most commonly used incorrect factor was population density, which candidates were interpreting as a physical factor. And this is where, again, students make simplistic errors that really do cost them, and it's stopping that. That's, I think, for all of us, very difficult to do. The first example here, proximity. Those close to the hazard itself will feel both it and its effects more violently. For example, these closer to the epicenter of an earthquake will experience more violent shaking and therefore have a greater extent of damage, injuries, and deaths. Yeah, that's a great answer. It's a fully developed answer. and shows a good 3 out of 3 marks. The second example shows an example where a candidate has written about a human factor and so was not awarded any marks, regardless of whether it was right or wrong. So the moment it kind of drifts into that infrastructure and buildings make people more vulnerable, that's wrong, and therefore any explanation of that is wrong. Okay, so sad, but it does happen. But be aware, make sure they are explaining the right things. But it does happen. In this case, question 3, another resource question for 3B, suggests 2 reasons for the distribution of volcanoes. This question obviously required them to use the resource to suggest these reasons. Candidates needed to be specific for this for 4 marks, and a significant proportion of responses demonstrated purely AO2 evidence, as they did not contain any specific reference as to what was shown on the resource. So as you can see, it became a bit of an issue because they just sort of gave 2 reasons why, rather than an explanation of those. So if we look at these, volcanoes occur along plate boundaries, normally where plates pull apart. When that happens, magma rises to the top and causes volcanoes to form. Hotspots, for example, in the specific plate in figure 3B, hotspots are plumes of magma underneath. This one here was awarded 3 marks. There's a basic reason provided in the first part, and then the point related to hotspots, which uses named evidence from it. So it doesn't actually tell us anything about the distribution as much on those on the first part of it, but the second part was much better. Okay. As we move into 3G, this was analysing the impacts of volcanic eruptions on the environment, and it definitely required you to sort of mention the resource. As with other 8-mark questions, candidates need to apply that geographical understanding to the context shown. Candidates were able to use the resource to consider various impacts of the eruption. Some responses steered far too heavily on impacts on people and the economy rather than the environment. Few candidates made use of the map shown in the area as prone to ashfall, for instance, and better responses used the map to begin to make links to the potential impacts of coastal areas shown on it. So things like pollution or whatever it might be. In this sort of area here, this is the impacts of volcanic eruptions. In figure 3C, the potential impacts of volcanic eruptions are shown through the graph and descriptions. So it actually sort of does quite well to start with. It demonstrates a clear attempt at analysing as well, which is good because the high-level responses will do that. This response here, which is fully developed on page 85 of the examiner's report, has 3 developed ideas. They're all linked to the environment, but also made a distinction between short and long-term impacts, showing a clear understanding, and therefore it managed to get top marks. It was really good answer. It was the impacts to be positive and short-term impacts to be negative, reaching the top level. So it actually shows that in the short term, these impacts can be very, very negative, but in the long term, they can have benefits. So that was really good, solid answer. In this question, again, this is a lower level response. This response, which is on page 92, demonstrates what a typical low level response would look like. It describes the data, provides basic points on impacts, lacks any focus on the environment. This example had 2 impacts with some simplistic sort of AO3. It's linked to each to reach a middle of level 1. The first point is stronger as the candidate uses the scale on the figure and makes a link to the environment. The second point is more focused on the economic impacts. The comments here relate to this particular question, but relates to all of the 8-mark analysis questions on paper 1 and paper 2 in terms of how performance differs between the levels. They both use the same marking approach and require the use of resources with the same AO balance. So it's important that candidates recognise this. When you bullet point, it's not always the best way. It helps in some respects, but it can be quite limiting for students. So volcanic eruptions was 7 kilometers away from the Albi, from Albany. Gulf, however, it went into the lagoon, Laguna Gulf, which affects animals because the water is unsafe to drink. So again, you can see it's a bit, doesn't really get to fully grips with it. It's basic reasoning. Volcanic eruptions also can't cause farmers' crops or destroys them, which also destroys their first source of income, meaning that farmers can't provide for their families. So you can see there that point is irrelevant because it's about the environment. Okay, so again, drifting off the point is important. It's something we can do in this area here. Charlotte's asked, would you suggest they need a conclusion in the 8 markers or mini conclusion at the end of each point? Not necessarily. I think you can certainly, if you're analysing it, you can make a judgment, if you like. Writing a conclusion might be okay for some students, but I would suggest just making a judgment on it, and that should help with the analysis. There's no reason to make a judgment because you're analysing the impacts. This causes this, and there's an example of it, and it's that kind of thing. But as you saw with the first question, it does help you develop that point. And it just shows you how you can get to that top end by pointing to the data, giving an impact on the, and then focusing directly on the impact on how it affects people. Okay. Okay. So moving on to the next slide. Now we're on to section B. So the comments here are all in the principal's examiners and refer to question 4 and 5, and this is all about the fieldwork. And they also apply briefly to sections 5 and questions 5 and 6, because the questions are in parallel and the resources are similar, but the fieldwork context differs depending whether candidates chose rivers, coasts, or hazards. In this series, the fieldwork section was comprised of short answer questions on unfamiliar fieldwork with the extended writing on a familiar fieldwork context as well. So you'll know this from your own work. Firstly, question 4A, state one risk the student should have prepared for when carrying out fieldwork. So really, candidates need to identify a risk they might need to have prepared for. It did not require a mitigation strategy. Some provided both, however. Some candidates just provided the mitigation strategy rather than the risk itself as well. And in the first example, there is a clear risk here in terms of slippy rocks. The second example, there is only the mitigation strategy, but no risk. So, for instance, going in groups isn't is a mitigation strategy really rather than risk. And it highlights the importance of focusing specifically on parts of the question. I think that's one thing as an examiner, sort of examiner on several papers on both the international and the A-level, that students tend to always drift away from the question or don't answer it fully. It is really hard. I think it's hard for students to get that point. It's hard for students to develop that. It's hard for us as teachers to help them develop that. But it's certainly something that all of us should be really working hard at making sure they answer the question, because sometimes they don't. And I think in this question here, going in groups, I think is that they've not really thought it through, and they've underlined risk and prepared for. They've not really answered the question. While slippery rocks, the students can slip on and fall into the water and hurt themselves. That's a risk, and therefore it gets the full marks for it. In terms of question 4C, suggest one reason for the relationship shown. This question required us, or candidates, to suggest a reason for the relationship shown on the graph they just plotted some additional data on. The first mark is awarded for identifying the relationship, and the other mark is for explaining why that relationship actually occurs. Many candidates here were able to provide both parts. Some candidates stated the relationship without offering an explanation, and that really only could result in 1 mark. This is demonstrated by the 2 examples. The first has both parts. As the river velocity increases, it erodes more quickly. That's 1 mark, making it wider as there is less resistance, 1 mark. With the second example just getting 1 mark for the relationship correctly identified. So the first one is 2, and the second one is 1. As channel width increases, river velocity also increases. There's not a reason there. It's just this leads to that, but without any reasoning to it at all. Explain 1 primary data collection method students might have found using useful in their river inquiry. For this question, we're really required to explain 1 other primary collection method they might have found useful. Some responses identified this. Some described the method rather than explain why it would be useful, and again, misreading the question slightly. Some candidates wrong about 1 of the methods or data already shown in the resource they had already interacted with, such as river depth or velocity, and therefore could not be awarded any marks as the question stated another reason, not the same. This example here was awarded 3 marks as it highlighted a relevant method, clearly explained how it would be useful to gain the 3 marks. So it says field sketches, that's 1 mark, to record information about each site, compare later on, 1 mark. This can be used to represent the gradient, 1 mark, and vegetation cover as well, so 1 mark. So they did more than what was necessary here. So it was a good example. Okay. As we move into the 8 marker here, evaluate the accuracy and reliability of your data collection. This question is now focused on what fieldwork the candidates actually completed. This is their familiar fieldwork context. And candidates here should be reminded that it's important to write their responses in the correct inquiry question. Centres should also be reminded that for question 6 in hazardous environments, the focuses should be on extreme weather. The specification is clear that the inquiry needs to be focused on extreme weather events and not tectonics. A few candidates did write about tectonics. This question also asks candidates to evaluate the accuracy and reliability of their data collection methods. There were some excellent responses to this question, really, showing that some really interesting fieldwork that was done, with the majority of the responses being focused on data collection methods. This response here that you may be reading works through each of those data collection methods and evaluates them in turn. They provide specific examples for limitations as well as strengths of each method. They make reference to the actual sampling strategy and the impact this may have had on the reliability of their results. It's a strong response which remained focused on the question throughout, demonstrating that candidates had completed fieldwork and showed a good awareness of the strength and limitations of that data collection method. So you can see this has been a really well thought out level 3 answer, and it got 8 out of 8. Okay. Again, the lower level ones, if we see them, tend to always follow the same sort of focus. It's the vagueness focused on few data collection methods rather than a selection of them. Some moved on to different inquiry stages that were not linked to questions or methods. The response here demonstrates 1 data collection method with some exploration of the strengths and limitations that allowed it to move into level 2. There are some parts of the answers that move on to different inquiry questions, however, and therefore those aren't awardable. These can all be found, as I said, this one's on page 114 to 115 of the examiner's report, which are a really good way for us to benefit our teaching. So again, the vagueness of this answer only got it into level 2, and therefore it was unable to fully develop that answer. Okay, and we'll move on to paper 2, section A. So I'm just reading through the questions. I can't see the questions, so I'm having to stop every so often. Okay, let me just have a look back to where we were. There we go. Could you include any case study material I've seen in the source, e.g., E15? Yeah, if it's a difficult one to say. At Maximo here, is there any guidance to secure high-level scores? If this is referring back to one of the 8 markers, I think it's development of points. If it's an 8 marker and it has some case study development, if the case study is relevant, yes. If the case study isn't, then not necessarily. If you're trying to explain a point and you use a case study to explain that point, then that's a good way of doing it. It's about, for each one, developing that idea, developing that explanation, and an assessment or value judgment of it. If it's an analyze question, that you analyze it and infer why it's done what it's done. It's a difficult one to say. When I get to the next 8 marker, I'll talk about. Let me just read the next one. Yeah, I think Jonathan makes a good point there. Yeah, no, definitely, I agree with that, Jonathan. It is the candidate's ability to demonstrate that they've used the resource to form a judgment about a particular geographical issue. That's true, and that's why sometimes the case study isn't necessary. But certainly that conceptual knowledge is much better. But if it helps them to support their argument, I think the one sort of negative of that, if you like, if students start thinking about using their case study, then they may well move away from actually using the resource itself, and that will then drag it down a bit, if you like. So to make that level 3, if you're using it to benefit the question, then that's fine. If you're using it not to, and just using it on its own and using it as a crutch, then that would be a bit of an issue in terms of getting those marks. Okay, I think sort of, yeah, I'm just going through. Okay, all right. Okay, I'm sorry. It's just that with the screens, I can't actually read what's put in these answers, if you like, that you're saying. I'm trying to get it so that I can see that a little bit better, so I can see when they come up. Okay, many candidates here in question 1E for a named developing or emerging country explain one positive and one negative impact of economic sector shift. Okay, so here candidates were able to provide suitable positive and negative impacts of an economic shift for a developing or emerging country. Not all candidates were able to select the right development context for this answer, and these 4 marks questions required 2 developed points, and it was the fact that they couldn't provide the development generally would cost them. So in this case here, we've got the question here. There was a basic idea for a positive answer, positive impact, sorry, and a developed idea for the negative impact. So overall, we got 3 marks here. So the positive, growth of economy due to people working in higher sectors. Again, that's that woolliness, if you like, of the answer. It doesn't really be specific. Whilst people have nowhere to work in lower sectors because of new technologies and may have other qualifications to work somewhere else is slightly better. Okay. In question 1F, the 3 marks here for it. This is suggest one possible reason for a trend in the level of investment shown. The majority of answers focused on the investment in the buildings and are and there was a large part of the bars shown, but few candidates used the data from the graph to support their answer. This response recognised the increase in investment using evidence for the resource and then link this to education and how this may lead to further investments. These questions are a mix of AO3 and AO2, so it is important that there is some use of the resource in the response. So making sure they maybe start with the response would be really useful in getting to that top area. Okay. So you can see here, figure 1 shows that energy efficiency investment has increased from approximately 255 billion in 2015 to almost 300 billion. So they've made a point and then they've gone out to help explain that trend. Okay. So in this question, here you can see these 8-mark analysis questions require a blend of use of the resource with knowledge and understanding. These aren't case study questions themselves, but as we said earlier, in terms of that 8 question, we're not expecting you to use a resource here. We're not expecting you to develop a resource, but you may well, a case study, but you may offer it to give an example to help develop your skill, if you like. To reach the higher levels, candidates need to do more than just describe what is presented, but provide clear, developed reasons. This analyse needs to be addressed to achieve full marks, and at the lower end, marks of candidates tend to be very descriptive or provide only basic reasons. So again, going back to the questions earlier, saying should we put a conclusion in? It's not necessary for an analyzed question. You're not making conclusions based on the analysis, but you could, certainly in terms of making a judgment or something like that would be useful. Okay. So here's another where this is another question. This one here was done much better. Candidates attempted to address the command word, often starting with an idea about which reason was the most important. This response provided a detailed discussion of the information provided in the resource and clear analysis, which was also summarized at the end. And this therefore clearly fitted into the level 3 descriptor in the mark scheme. In particular, the part about synthesizing relevant understanding coherently leading to judgments that are supported by evidence throughout. So that level 3 part really does fit in. If you want a tip, approach this particular set of AOs. It's a learned skill and it can be practiced as part of the learning process. So this can all be sort of learned in terms of how you analyze these things. So this was a good answer and did very well. It got 8 out of it. Question 2D here. State one commercial farming can affect rural environments. Again, we're looking for that statement of fact rather than anything else, and not a reason or anything like that. It can be positive or negative as well, so that's worth remembering. And deforestation, for instance, that this candidate has used here, is not going to be sufficient by just stating deforestation in this case. So on its own, it would be insufficient, but actually explained would be better. Occasionally, answers were far too vague or related to urban environments. So this it can lead to deforestation occurring as land is needed to facilitate the growth of crops and rearing of livestock. So that they've developed that point of deforestation, and that was a good answer. Okay. Here, in terms of 2E, explain 2 reasons accessibility is important in rural environments. Here, many candidates provided clear, developed reasons why accessibility is important in rural environments. There were some candidates who provided mirror responses, so this limited their marks, as we've mentioned earlier. So important for access to towns and cities for residents, and important for businesses to access towns and cities, provided those sort of answers need to be much more distinct. Some were too broad, too vague to be considered developed as well. This example here shows a typical response with 2 basic reasons around access to facilities such as hospitals and getting to work. But there's no real further development of those points. So people who live in rural areas may need access to the central business district to access facilities such as hospitals in case of emergencies. But again, it just needs that development. People who live in rural environments need to be able to get to work every day on time. Again, vague, far too broad for us to actually fully accept. In the analyze question, the sort of it's important here to analyze the importance of natural ecosystems. It required us to importance of natural ecosystems, for provision of goods. The resources shows both ecosystems and services, are ecosystem goods on one side, services on the other. Most candidates formed an argument which either suggested goods or services were important. Both approaches were valid, as this is an allies question, so it's quite easy to go into one good, reasons for why ecosystems are good and why the services are good as well. Judgments were often quite well supported, and again, you can use your own evidence for that. But there is no requirement to use all the points on the resource, as it'd be a long essay if it was. Higher level responses tended to provide several developed ideas with the use of the resource, maybe 3-4 ideas well developed. Lower level responses tended to just work through the diagram in a very descriptive manner, and that tended to lead to basic points. In terms of question 2H here, in terms of the importance of these, you must refer to it. These responses achieved level 3, 8 marks, as it's considered a range of ideas in detail and made good use of resources. It also makes a clear judgment at the end. The second response on page 37 of the principal examiner's report was more typical of a level 1 response, which provided a series of basic points. And I think that's sort of really key in understanding it. And I think candidates can learn a lot from marking these kind of things. You give them to students to say, I want you to mark this, see what you feel, pick out the good, pick out the bad points. And that allows them to see where they're going wrong with their own answers as well, I think. In terms of question 3F, this really required candidates to suggest one way that rapid urbanisation could have affected the trends shown. Many candidates did use the data, which was good. Most candidates would focus on one of those trends, and there was no requirement at all, because it's only worth 3 more marks to consider all of them. They really should have made a choice, and that was the important thing to recognise. So here, responses scoring 3 marks would often include data to demonstrate the trend. That's always good idea. Start with the data or a description, then show how that's supported by the data. Like this example here, which includes the trend, uses the figure, and then links this to traffic increase and the burning of fossil fuels. Good, solid 3-mark answer. Some candidates, though, missed the part about the trend and just provided the impacts of rapid urbanisation. So the idea that it's rising, it's leading to the reason for that, and then leading to an increase in particle matter or increasing sort of fossil fuel burning. Again, on this one, analyse the possible reasons for the changes shown. Here, this question required candidates to analyse for 8 marks again, where many responses focused on changes to megacities. There was, again, no requirement to focus on all aspects of the resource. Higher level responses tended to make good use of the resource by choosing to explore responses for some of the different changes and provided a summary statement about which was the most important. As we can see in this example here, which I'm about to show you, that we can see that this example was done whilst lower level responses tended to describe the difference between the years. So we can see here that candidates really should practice using resources a lot to analyse the importance of factors or ideas. demonstrating they can make connections between them to provide evidence and informed analysis. Candidates should ensure they have a range of developed points and clear judgment to fulfill that analyze command word. Okay, so that clear judgment is really important, as I said earlier, rather than a conclusion, if you like. Okay, so now paper 2, section B. All the comments here that I'm going to go through are all on the principal examiner's report. They refer to question 6, as this is the most popular option on the paper, but also apply to 4 and 5. This is because the questions run in parallel and the resources are very similar. But the fieldwork context differs depending whether candidates choose energy and economic activity, rural or urban environments. So we start with explain one factor that affected the decision on the sites you chose to collect your data. Most candidates focused on the practical nature of being able to get to the sites and back to school again, which that's a valid answer. Some that focused on their decision to use particular sampling methods, which affected the sites that were chosen as well. So some good understanding here. So accessibility is explained here is a factor we considered. We had to choose 2 sites which we could get to and investigate, and we're not too far away, and they must be related to some central business district. And so you can see how it's developed. It's a good answer that received full marks. So the idea about secondary data, explain one way secondary data was used to support your inquiry. Many candidates were able to identify how it was used to support the inquiry, which was good. And they were able to identify a type of data collection method and often could provide a suitable explanation. And it's sometimes it was encouraging here to see that often quite specific types of secondary data were used, such as reports or websites with specific data sets mentioned. That's good. Being specific is always beneficial for them for the market. There were some good developed responses provided around the use of old photographs and old articles as well. Where candidates had a specific type of secondary data, such as census, they tended to move often. They tended to fully get the 3 marks as they had a clear idea of how it used. However, weaker responses tended to provide more vague ideas, such as a map to provide ideas of a study location, for instance. So it wasn't fully developed, or it's just too vague, if you like, and too broad. There were some candidates, unfortunately, who did not recognize the focus was on secondary data and develop their primary data instead. So again, learning those key elements is really important. Question 6E. The question requires candidates to explain one advantage and one disadvantage of data presentation techniques. There is no requirement to focus on the same technique for both here. You could have done one good one about one point and then a disadvantage about something completely different. But most candidates tended to focus on both, if you like. And the most common response focused on bar charts and pie charts. Many candidates also provided quite vague answers, such as easy to read or easy to compare. And whilst these could gain some marks, they lacked that full development for full marks. A common mistake here was made by candidates was to write about data collection methods rather than data presentation techniques. This one here, as you can read, scored full marks because there was a developed advantage and a disadvantage. And it's important, whereas at a particular stage of the inquiry question, that candidates name what they are writing about. So there's a clear factor here that making sure that candidates have an idea of each part of the inquiry question and what they're doing and where they're doing it. Okay. So in terms of this question, this was there based on an unfamiliar fieldwork context. As it's a split 4-mark AO3 and 4 marks AO4, candidates need to identify points from the resource to support their ideas. So these can start there and develop. Higher level responses tended to take a balanced approach, recognizing some suitable aspects on the inquiry while highlighting the flaws. And candidates tended to be very effective at critiquing the type of questions used in the interview guide. Many candidates provided suggestions how aspects could be improved. Weaker responses tended to provide just a basic overview. In this response that we're going to see in the next page, it scored 3 marks as this clear evaluation of the equipment and data collection methods used. And there is a clear conclusion which reinforces the candidate's ideas, making a judgment about how successful they would be for the inquiry question, which demonstrated clear evaluation. So here we've got a conclusion. And although, as we've said, this one says evaluate the choice of equipment of the data collection used, you must refer to the resource in your answer. It would be useful if candidates really made sure that they wrote effective evaluations using the resource that are included in the paper, what parts of the resource that demonstrate strengths of the inquiry and parts which demonstrate weaknesses. Are these things that could be improved? How can you improve something? Having that nature about your resource, having that nature about your study, understanding what was good and what wasn't so good about it is a real key skill for any geographer at any age and at any level. Okay, hopefully that gives you a good rounded figure of an understanding that paper. We're now going to look at section C on paper 2. This focuses really on question 7, which is the most popular option, but the comments in terms of performance again have relevance for question 8 and 9, as similar issues related to candidates were experienced across all the questions. So this response refers to regions and the data related to the regions and addresses the pattern part of the question. These are relevant and so provide a 2 + 2 for 4 marks. So here we're expecting them to do 2 specific things and explain them. So this is about the patterns shown in terms of demonstrating what's going on the picture. Can they see a pattern? Can they explain it? Can they justify it? So here we see the first one here. This response was worth 4, as I said before. Much of Asia is at high risk of drought. This could be because the nations are emerging, developing, so much of their land is used for agriculture. This may lead to increased overcultivation, which dries the land out of soil. That's a decent point. North Europe and Scandinavia have low levels of risk. This is because they are further from the equator, good point, meaning they have cooler temperatures, which means their land doesn't dry up as quickly. They also get lots of rain and snow. So that's a really good response. It's fully developed as well. The second one, this is was a typical response with 2 relevant reasons, but no reference to a pattern. So in this case, because of the rainfall, they have very little rainfall in those affected countries, the droughts. So you can see there's very much, they're not really telling us where, so that pattern isn't shown. They're just giving a vague reason as to why it might be the case. And therefore, it only got 2 marks. Hina, yes. I mean, most of the time, yeah, it is good practice to do those, to do real coursework for sure. I think students benefit from it. It's certainly a very important part of the course, and it's something that you should be building into it. Okay, so explain 2 potential impacts of climate change. So we want the explanation, the impact, and the explanation here. It requires that they do this twice. So there's a lot of strong responses to this question, which demonstrate that clear understanding of the impacts of climate change. Where candidates didn't achieve full marks, it was more limited. response, or where it was a slight steer away from the focus of the question, it into causes instead. That was a problem. There was a rare occasion where candidates did not address the question, focusing on causes of climate change rather than impacts, carbon emissions, deforestation. Candidates should practice developing their points for these 4 marks. Particular attention should be given to the question. Requirements for 1 or 2 ideas, reasons, impacts, factors, those sort of things, etc., would be really beneficial. So here, rising sea levels as global temperatures increase, causing more glaciers to melt, as well as increasing the rate of I can't read that. This will cause, evaporation. This will cause many countries and coastal areas to flood, with 40% of the global population at risk. So that's a good, solid point, well developed. More hazards. Climate change makes extreme weather more likely, or extreme weather events more likely. So again, they've developed their points really well. So it's a good, strong response. In terms of variations in field loss, candidates could either focus on the different makeup of reasons for forest loss, different reasons for forest loss, or focus on the causes of loss within a specific region would have been just as good. The initial point of variation could be developed either through further description of the difference or through the use of data. The most effective responses here would recognise where one of the causes of the loss was highest, Central South America, with the highest deforestation from agriculture, mining and urbanisation, and then provide a figure to support it. There were many candidates who did not focus on description, but attempted to explain reasons for the differences shown or provide definitions of deforestation or the causes of wildfires. So again, drifting slightly away from the question into areas they felt more comfortable. Candidates should practice again writing these descriptions of what can be seen in the graph. Can they describe differences for particular features of data? Can they effectively interpret the data, select suitable evidence to develop their points and show what they're capable of doing? Some candidates here didn't identify a variation and could not score any marks. Like the first response here, there is a large amount of deforestation in Central and South America. Okay, that's not a variation, that's just a statement. The next response scored 2 marks as there is a variation identified about overall forest loss with some data used to support this. In terms of, whilst the second one, that was the bottom one, sorry, in the second one, some responses didn't focus on the data at all. Wildfires are caused by, and doesn't really explain any variation again. So you can see students and candidates can sometimes just drift away from what they should be talking about. And it's really important that as teachers spend time developing those ideas, practicing them. It makes it so it's a good technique to use to make sure they can see those variations, make sure they can see differences, and give a reason as to why that might be the case. And question 7E here, assess the potential impacts of deforestation. The command word here is assess. Is one of the significant number of candidates have kind of difficulty understanding. In other words, candidates are required to rank or to make a judgment in this case about the potential impacts of deforestation. Candidates do not need to address all the aspects of the resource. They need to effectively use it to support their argument. So again, don't be using these as a crutch. Look at them, pick a couple, and go to explain them. Answers at the lower end of the marks will provide a brief comment about each impact, with more effective responses choosing 2 or 3, making clear judgments about which is the most important. And as we've said there, in terms of an examiner's tip, assess means use evidence to determine the relative significance of something, giving consideration to all factors and identify which is the most important. Now, in this case here, had you picked 2 or 3 of these, and which as a candidate you think are the most important, and you explain why one is more important than the other, and give some judgment as to that, that's the way to develop those answers and to get into those full marks. And here in 7E, assess the potential impacts of deforestation. This is on page 79 of the Principal Examiner's report and scores full marks. So you can read it all there. At the end, it includes assessment. At the end, there's a summary of the assessments at the end, but also includes that assessment throughout. The candidate uses ideas from the resource to structure their response. It's a good answer to show to weaker students to help develop their answers and develop their reasoning. Greater familiarity with assess and the commands and instructions is strongly recommended for future examinations. If they take this on to A-level or future, they're going to need to know how to assess properly. It may help candidates to begin their answer with their assessment and then use evidence to support their assessment. So if they begin with assessment, they can develop it throughout. It becomes more of a reflex, if you like. Yes, Mark, it says all factors, but it's all factors within that one factor. So if it's all the factors within the ones they choose, not all the factors on the resource. This next question, it must again, deforestation is the greatest threat to fragile environments. It's a disgusted view. So somebody has this view. Why do they have this view? It's worth sitting with students with older resources and check this and discuss. Why do you think somebody would have this view? It's has that unique command, and it's a unique set of AOs. It does AO2, AO3, and AO4. What is required is an assimilation, a use of the specific resources mentioned in the question, and then investigating the issues through the statement of whether you agree or disagree through reason or argument. So it's good to say, well, there's what I can understand this view because, or I disagree with this view because. In the case here on the next page, we're going to be looking at we're expecting candidates to discuss figures 7b and 7c. Deforestation is the greatest threat to fragile environments. It specifies which resources should be used. So to reach top levels, you're going to have to incorporate both of these. It's important that candidates remember to question requires their own knowledge and understanding really to get into that top bracket that support their ideas and not, again, use it as a crutch. There was some strong responses to this question. It's a nice question for students to get into. They should be able to develop their answers. Had good AO3 and AO4, but sometimes like that AO2, candidates should practice being able to produce balanced responses to help them provide material to discuss in these questions. Some past papers may be able to help with this, but also resources from newspapers and magazine articles and websites on relevant topics can also be good practice. Candidates should be practicing being able to demonstrate their knowledge and understanding in these longer extended response questions. Whether it should 2 large paragraphs, it's a difficult one for me to call. I would be on 3 really, and it would be agree, disagree, so on and so forth. But be aware to assess throughout, and whether you agree with that view or why specifically you don't agree with that view. So there isn't one perfect way of writing it. I would say that second way, Charlotte, is probably a little bit better. You would prefer it weaved through its effectiveness in terms of why somebody has that view and why somebody might not have that view. Why do you feel this one is more important than that reason, and so on. In this view here, as you can see, they've had a go. There were a lot of strong responses, as I said. You need to incorporate both. So it says there, figures 7C and 7B suggests all the potential impacts of deforestation and their significance. However, all are local impacts, unlike climate change. So they're arguing that in this case, climate change is much stronger. And that's so they've shown that the argument is good. So in this response here that you see, it's a clear level 3 where candidates have shown that clear understanding and interrelationships in geography. They deconstruct ideas across two resources, and make a clear judgment that's supported by what they've said. They've set out their view at the beginning, then return to this at the end, making it a really good answer. And they got 12 out of 12 for this. So again, if you go to the examiner's report, you'll be able to fully get this answer, be able to use this as a an answer that you could show students. You could say, here's a model answer on getting full marks, and underline not necessarily the actual argument, but the points they've made that have allowed them to access all AO2, AO3, and AO4 marks. So really, it's about blending their own ideas with unfamiliar resources that are provided. And these really do need analytical discussion are very important. Although it is the last question, it's the highest tariff, so candidates should be encouraged to attempt it. It's worth good marks, and if you think about it, if you could get students to do this, if you put it through as a debate, as Livingston's put there, you can do it that way for sure. But don't. You've got to make sure you've got that evidence in there, or else it's not going to work as a debate. So it's difficult sometimes for younger students or candidates to get that debate across to the examiner in a good way. So I'd be a little bit maybe careful. But it can be used. Okay. So having done that, so a summary from the examiner's report from paper 1 is when answering 8-mark longer response questions, be clear on the demands of the command word analyze. It requires investigation of issues by breaking it down into its different components and recognizing them and evidencing them. Recognize that these questions have an AO distribution. They're not just all AO2, so you've got to develop it AO3, AO4, and these are 4 marks each. Therefore, responses that are unbalanced will always be limited and not be able to access those higher marks. In questions where candidates are asked to develop a single reason, it's important to ensure that the appropriate number of links in the explanatory chain are developed. So it's them, point, explanation, or, and so on. These questions usually have a command word, suggest or explain. Many specific references to the resources for questions, make specific references where it's applicable. If the resource is there, it says using the resource, then make sure they use the resource. That's really important. But on the examiner's report on page 118, there is a full development and a full summary of what students will benefit from for paper 1. Advice for candidates: ensure the correct fieldwork question is being completed. Be confident in explaining the different stages in the geographical inquiry process and not just fieldwork methods. That's the bit they kind of remember because they've done. It's the rest of it that needs to be as well developed in their understanding. Be aware of the differences between risk and risk mitigation. Know how to calculate all measures of central tendency. That tended to be an issue for some candidates. And be confident in drawing lines of best fit. Be confident as well in explaining relationships in data. Lots of practice. Practice makes perfect on these things. It's always good. Always be using the data. Always be using resources to allow students to develop their understanding of data. Follow the instructions on the front of the exam paper. If all questions are attempted, there will not be enough time. They cannot answer all the questions. They have to do the ones they've learned. That can be that little bit of exam stress. There's not much we can do about that, but ensure that students are well prepared beforehand and know what they're doing. In terms of paper 2, when answering the extended response questions, be clear about the differences between the requirements for different command words. There is a good example of all. So analyze, evaluate, assess, discuss. In the 12-mark extended response questions, section C, it's important to remember there are AO2 marks which require their own knowledge and understanding to be demonstrated, as well as a clear interpretation of the resources. Make good use of those resources. It's important in the lower tariff questions where there is a resource related to the question that these are referred to in some form. And again, here we've got a full summary on page 114 and 115 of all the paper 2 responses. So Hina has said, could you suggest a suitable source for teachers to help students practice the fieldwork questions? I would say exam papers. They're all there. You know how the exam works from previous papers. You can use them. You can use your own fieldwork. You can set questions on your own fieldwork to develop their understanding from their fieldwork themselves to the different areas of the inquiry question process. So the summary here for paper 2, the number of marks awarded for each question is a guide as to how many or how much ideas need to be developed. As 2 marks described question requires only some development to reach the second mark, while a third 3 mark explain requires full further development. Where questions require description of data, it's important that this is a focus of the response rather than trying to explain particular features of the data. Description can be identification of a trend or a pattern, sort of increase, decrease, or fluctuation, something like that, which can be developed with a further description, particular years, for instance, where the pattern and trend changed, or through the use of data support on the initial point. But pay attention to the stages of the inquiry being assessed to ensure you are providing the right response. For example, recognizing the difference between data collection methods and data presentation methods. Create tables of this with your students to make sure they understand which ones go where, what it is, how it is, and use sample assessment materials, specimen papers, past papers to help familiarize candidates with the structure of the paper and the style of questions that are available. So, in terms of sport, what can we offer? I noticed John had been on earlier answering a few questions, which I was very grateful for. You've got access to scripts. You can click to add sort of content access to scripts. It's a free online portal which allows teachers to immediately access electronically marked exam scripts, which is good. Provide enhanced transparency, offers transparent approach to marking process, and this helps provide you with a better understanding of marking before requests for inquiry about results are made, remarks, things like that. It provides excellent aid for you as teachers and preparing other cohorts for examinations by helping you to evaluate a student's response on a particular question in relation to what they've been taught. So you can show, look, they learned this and this is how they responded. Available instantly from results day for all examination series for a defined window. You can view and download scripts which are marked online free of charge from our self-service portal. For more information on the ATS and the post-results window, visit the post-results page. I find that invaluable. I always download at least 3 very good scripts with permission, and 3 weaker scripts as well, to show and demonstrate if you can get top, middle, and bottom if you like, and show how candidates can push their way through the grades. In terms of Results Plus, another very useful device. This is a free online results analysis tool. It provides detailed breakdowns of student performance in the Edexcel exams, identifies topics and questions where the students could benefit from further learning and inform teaching strategies and approaches. It can benchmark your school's performance against other schools in your country, in your area, and so on and so forth. It's not just a post-results tool. Mock exam results can also be fed into the system, so you can produce analysis that way. You can find student results analysis from previous Pearson Edexcel schools. You can use Results Plus Direct, gives your students access to their final grades and their performance breakdown wherever they are. Schools can sign up for free at Results Plus accounts in just a few quick and easy steps, and this helps them and as well as you to use it to develop their understanding. And another really useful tool we use is Exam Wizard. It's a free tool for teachers which helps you to make quick homework assignments, topic tests, mock exams, questions tagged against units, topics, assessment objectives, or simply choose a whole past paper. It's good. I use this quite a lot. I use this to set up my mock exams. Because you can drag and drop. It's a little bit clunky, but it does work, and once you've persevered, it's really good. It brings down the mark schemes, the examiner's reports for insights as well. Most recent exam content, is available within a year or so. They always lock out the previous year because people use it as mocks as well. Use the results to understand where students need more support, informing teaching strategies. Really good resource, I find that one. And another great resource is John. John, you can ring him, you can contact him in several different ways, sign up for the subject advisor updates, or even book an appointment with him. He's a very useful young man, and he's very good to take advantage of. He understands a lot about the qualifications, and I've spent time with John. He's always been very useful for us. So, to find out more for professional development courses, please see Pearson's Professional Development Academy. And that's about it, really. If it leaves me to say, and I'm sorry I've slightly overrun, it was a bit longer than we anticipated. Was or is there any questions we can end on? Other than that, thank you so much for joining. It's been a pleasure to talk to you today, and I hope you've got something from the session. Thank you.